Today on the Solar Podcast, the economics of renewable energy legislation. My guest today is repeat guest, Dr. David Loomis. He is the co-founder of the Center for Renewable Energy at Illinois State University and the president of Strategic Economic Research. He has over 20 years of experience in energy and economic development analysis. Welcome back to the show, David.
Thank you, Tim, for having me back.
Great to see you again. And we are going to be breaking down a report you did for the Pathto100 legislation, which is one of the clean energy bills that we have here in Illinois. Check it out at pathto100.net. And I will also put the report on screen here during the course of the conversation, but you just click on the studies link there and you can find the report that we're referring to. And you have done many economic studies here in the Midwest on wind farms and now solar farms. And then this is kind of the cherry on top with some of this sweeping legislation that is being considered in Illinois. The other backdrop is that Governor Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, put a stake in the ground last year saying we're going to get 100% RPS by 2050. And now he has put some, he's crossed his I's and dotted his T's on that. And that legislation is now called the Consumer and Climate First Act. It was just released on April 29th, 2021. So that's happening in the background here. So good things are happening in Illinois. There is a challenging environment for renewable energy developers and installers because we had FEJA that really drove a huge wave of installations from 2017 to 2020. And now we're busting. It's a boom and a bust. And unless we get additional legislation, there will not be incentive money to drive the C&I, especially distributed generation, forward here in the Midwest. So that's kind of the context for this discussion. But give our listeners a high-level assessment from your perspective on what legislation like the Pathto100 could mean for Illinois.
Yeah, there's tremendous economic development aspects to the Pathto100 legislation. As we did the estimates, we were trying to take a conservative approach of what this would mean in terms of jobs and earnings. And according to my analysis, we'd see over 53,000 jobs created or supported during construction, and realize that those are, those are full-time equivalents. So if you think of those as job years in a certain sense, and although those get criticized sometimes as one-time jobs working on a project, people make a living doing construction, moving from one-time jobs to the next. And so those are important for our economy. And then there's an additional 3,200 long-term jobs that would be supported annually. So 3,200 permanent jobs, if you will, during that time. So I think there's, as we're looking, for a boost to the local economy, I think that's important. And the second thing to keep in mind is that these are jobs that are typically located in rural communities, in communities that are seeing declines in population. They're seeing net migration into larger cities and communities, and so it's not just for big cities, but it's in rural areas that will benefit from the construction and the ongoing jobs.
Indeed, and I will just give some highlights on what the Pathto100 is trying to achieve. At its core, it is about avoiding the bust, because the renewable energy credits that we had in Illinois are now dried up. And so if you're a facility owner, you can get your solar project in the queue, and you need to do that because the next wave of incentives is going to come. The only question is how soon. But the Pathto100 basically makes that money flow. And the goal is a 40% RPS by 2031. Today, we have a 25% RPS by 2025. We are still not on track to achieve that. So we do need more incentives to drive the clean energy industries forward. And if you're not familiar with how these things are influential in clean energy, the backdrop to this is that we have very cheap, dirty power in Illinois, and some of it is low carbon energy. That we have 50% of our grid powered by nuclear, but much of it is cheap coal, and we're supplanting that now with wind, solar, and battery storage en masse. And it's not a question of if, but when we do that. So the Pathto100 and now the governor's Consumer and Climate First Act, what these bills do is they say, okay, consumers, we're going to collect a little bit more money from you on your power bill. And then that money is going to drive the growth of wind and solar. For residential, the subsidies were 7 cents a kWh, and you're paying 9 cents here in Illinois as a consumer, perhaps 9 to 11 cents.
Mhm.
And so that 7-cent incentive for solar is very generous, and it really gets consumers to go, oh yeah, and business owners.
Mhm.
And it's really across the board for distributed generation. There were carve outs for utility scale, which catalyzed some projects. Now a lot of these utility scale projects are just happening because the owners of power plants, the utilities, like Alliant, okay, in Wisconsin, like
Mhm.
NIPSCO in Indiana, like Excel in huge swaths of the Midwest, right? They are retiring their fleets of fossil technologies. These are gas and coal plants, and replacing them with wind, solar, and storage because the economics are just better, right? They want to return a better ROI to their investors. And the way to do that is to go wind, solar, and battery storage.
Mhm.
So, in the greater scheme of things, it's all good. Economics is driving the energy transition, right? But at the local scale, for consumers and business owners, for us to have distributed generation, we still need incentives. And the other important thing to note is that fossil technology is hugely incentivized, and we're largely ignorant, and they're largely invisible. But something like 6% of global GDP goes to subsidize fossil technologies. And so it's always been the case that we are going to subsidize energy. It's something that everybody needs, and it's kind of the grease that makes the economy work, right? And these transitions have happened many times before. This one is just going from fossil to wind, solar, and battery storage. There'll be other technologies like fusion that come down the pipe. We happen to have a fusion reactor in the sky called the sun, which is shining photons on us every day, and we are converting them to electricity with solar panels. And they also make the wind blow every day, and lots of wind energy here in the Midwest. So maybe you could give our listeners, though, David, a little background on how do you approach this, because this is a pretty big challenge, I would imagine, to take this legislation and then translate that into, well, how does this play out? What is that process? And yeah, and how does that unfold?
Yeah. So you're looking, into the future. Economic impact analysis is driven by investment numbers. So we're looking at the cost of these systems. And so when we did the analysis of Pathto100, we included not just the utility scale wind and solar, but all of the distributed generation on the solar side, all of the programs that were addressed in the Pathto100. and then said, we expect cost declines, right? So that's the reason that we're in this transition, is because solar has declined so much in terms of the cost. Wind as well, but solar's declined more rapidly than wind, so there may be a crossover point if those trends continue. But then we looked and said, okay, we're going to expect to have those cost declines. So that actually reduces the economic impact because it's cheaper. It's better from the economics in terms of the market and selling it, but it's worse in terms of the economic impact because you're driving those numbers off of investments. And if it's cheaper, then it creates less jobs. But we tried to be intellectually honest in the report. If you want to see, you can see all the tables of all the assumptions that we made on those cost assumptions moving forward, how much wind and solar, C&I, residential, is all broken down in there, and our projections of procurements that would be done by the Illinois Power Agency. So once you have those numbers then collected to say, here's our megawatts, here's our costs per megawatt assumptions, then we feed those into an economic model called IMPLAN. We drive the results through the IMPLAN multipliers, and IMPLAN is just a standard economic development software that was first developed out of University of Minnesota and then became a commercial product. But many, economic development people will use IMPLAN for all kinds of different purposes. We're going to build a new hospital in the community. What's the economic impact of that? There's going to be, a new Rivian factory here that purchased the old Mitsubishi. They'll do IMPLAN for that. So it's a standard product. And then we take those multipliers, look at that investment, and we've used software out of the National Renewable Energy Labs called the JEDI model, Jobs and Economic Development Impacts, which kind of meshes those two together. Here's the investment that's being made. Here are the multipliers, what industry segments get affected, and how many jobs are produced, what are the earnings, and what's the economic output.
Very good. I'm going to put some of these graphs on screen so people can see what we're talking about. And, here, and this is all at the Pathto100.net. If you go to that, then go to studies, you'll see the report. And so this figure, economic impacts of Illinois projected solar and wind projects 2021 to 2033. You see total full-time FTE during construction and during operations, right? And it's tens of thousands of construction jobs, 53,000 construction jobs, 3,200 long-term jobs. And this is only the 40% RPS by 2031, right?
Correct.
If we go for 100 by 2050, we're going to accelerate these figures by some factor, maybe not quite 2, but we're definitely going to accelerate these. Well, yeah, maybe it is by 2. I don't know, but that's a steeper climb, so to speak.
Yeah.
And then, of course, this translates into economic activity, total earnings during construction, $4 billion, total earnings during operations, $219 million per year. Right now, that is equivalent to the REC incentive, right? We're putting about $200 million into the economy and incentives, and it's going to come back to us. And that's the beauty of these incentives, really, is there's always a multiplier, right? So you get more than $1 out. When you put $1 in, you get more than $1 out in net economic benefit.
Mhm.
And could you explain that? How does that work?
Yeah, I think you picked up on a great example. If you just look at those earnings, that $220 million annually in terms of earnings, that is for um, the jobs that were created or supported in the previous table and section. But then you get additional benefits that flow out of that. You get property tax revenue because the wind and solar projects are going to enhance the property tax base. And a whole section of the report quantifies the benefits in terms of all the taxing entities from utility scale wind and solar in that section, because that was all the property tax records that we could track to say what's the incremental value of wind and solar. But those are benefits that flow out to the community. The largest beneficiary there in terms of property taxes is to local school districts. But the county, the township, the road district, the libraries, the parks district, all get a piece of that. So that is on top of that, those earnings, because the earnings is just for the jobs that are created. So it's additional benefits that flow out. And as well, the land lease payments are not included in those earnings records. So farmers, landowners are going to be leasing their land to these wind and solar projects on the utility scale, and that then provides those payments. What's interesting though is, if you looked at number of jobs created per megawatt, the lowest would be on those utility scale projects for that. So you move into the distributed generation side, or even community scale projects, and you're going to have a much bigger impact in terms of the jobs that are created. You just think about rooftop solar, and it's much more complicated, obviously, than putting a racking system and have a ground mount and just put them all lined up. A lot more design goes into it. A lot more, labor is going to go into that. But then, we're using a rooftop, and individuals have that behind the meter, and so from an economic impact, jobs per megawatt, you're really sliding higher on the distributed generation side. So I think we need both. I don't think you want to, say one or the other. I think we're going to need to grow in both, but there are different economic impact yields.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. I say it's a both and. We want distributed generation. Distributed generation is so good for consumers to be able to put a power plant on your roof, or for business owners. Now you can put a power plant with a solar array, a battery in your garage, and you can have resiliency. We saw the catastrophe in Texas when the ERCOT grid failed in February, and the suffering that ensues, right? If the grid goes down, it's a real crisis for health and just survivability. I mean, your life becomes pretty miserable if you don't have electricity.
Mhm.
And so DG and incentivizing DG is extremely important. And then um let's talk a little bit about these uh these segments, right? This graph on screen here, economic impacts, which I didn't show before, is the total for Pathto100 2021 to 2033, $8.2 billion in during construction, and $571 million a year during operations. There's three segments here that you're looking at: on-site labor impacts, indirect supply chain impacts, and induced impacts. let's talk about all three of those, um, and and I also want to harken back to what you said about rural communities, right? Our rural communities are really struggling. They're losing population. People don't want to stay on the farm anymore. They want to go to the city. That's where the action is. And this is a boon for farmers. This is actually helping farmers stay on their land because it's guaranteed income. If they lease their land to a solar developer or a wind developer, that company or whoever ends up owning it is going to keep that plant running for 30 years. And so it's guaranteed income. Whereas if they're farming, they're at the mercy of the climate, and they'll have good years and bad years, right? And a farmer can triple their income on a per acre basis by renting their land to a developer. So it really is good for rural communities. And you mentioned that the lion's share of the revenue, the long-term revenue, is going to school districts. There's many taxing bodies in Illinois that will benefit, including, the county government. But you want to fund your schools, right? That is the future of your community, giving a good education to our young people. So let's talk about these segments, though: project development, indirect, supply chain, and induced impacts.
Yeah, yeah. So I think sometimes we undersell, or we don't count jobs correctly, because oftentimes when we're talking about a new project, all we look at are the people that are on site that are actually doing the work. And we say, oh, those are the jobs that are created. But I think the value that comes in an economic impact study is to say, no, there are layers that are hidden from your eyes that really count. And I think these graphs illustrate that, where the darker shaded ring is those project development and on-site labor impact. So those are the jobs that you're going to be able to count if you go on site and say how many people are installing this, constructing this project, whether it be distributed generation, utility scale, and that's where that darker shade comes from. But you'll notice in both of the graphs that the bigger ring is actually that medium shaded ring, which is the indirect impact. So these are all of the, they could be a turbine, they could be module, supply chain impacts. And typically it's not the turbine itself, but it's components to the turbine. It's not modules that we're going to be building locally, but it is racking systems, it's electrical that goes into it. It may be concrete, it's going to be aggregate. And all of those things, just due to the economics of the project, are typically going to be sourced locally, because it costs too much in terms of transportation to import many of those components of a project from out of the county or out of the state. So they're inherently local. And this also includes manufacturing impacts. So you look at manufacturers and say, how much is that going to play in to this project? So that's where that other ring comes from. We call those indirect impacts. And then the final ring is what's called induced impacts. Because people have more jobs in those direct and indirect components, they're going to go out and make household purchases. They're going to dine out when we're able to do that freely. They're going to buy groceries. They're going to spend it on entertainment. They're going to buy a bigger house. They're going to make household purchases to furnish that. And so all of that spending gets captured in that induced impact. So really the economic impact combines all three of those elements. And I just want to comment as well on you mentioned the school districts. I was astounded as we look at, obviously in Illinois, we have not increased K through 12 funding. for the last 2 years. I don't think the proposed budget has an increase. In the original legislation, schools were supposed to get a $350 million increase each and every year for 10 years, for a total of $3.5 billion that we're going to invest in our schools. And because we don't have the money, we haven't been doing that for the last 3 years. But when you look at the impact that projects have made, we went through, and the number one taxing entity that benefited from utility scale wind and solar was the Ridgeview School District right here in McLean County. They received almost $18 million in increased property tax revenue just from the wind farms that they've had. And then the Tri-Valley School District got $8.4 million. That's also in McLean County. And then Unit 5 School District that my daughter goes to, I'll add, received $7.6 million. So it's, schools are the highest tax rates in any jurisdiction. And so they're going to get the lion's share of that revenue.
So you have a section here on county tax revenue. Explain this to me though. This is the total tax revenue, and then you're breaking out later on what the impact of wind was historically to these districts. Is that right?
That's right. So the previous total, our previous chart was the total over all the years. So if you were fortunate enough to have one of the very early wind farms and a large one, so that's why McLean County is so far ahead, is just because we've had the Twin Groves wind farm and we have the White Oak wind farm that were very early on and of considerable size. So they've been collecting that tax revenue from those two projects for quite a number of years, and so that's why you see McLean County at the top there. It's not just because we have the most wind in terms of megawatts, but we also have the longevity to go along with it. But we tracked, it was a huge effort last summer to track every single wind turbine and utility scale solar. So we included solar in these estimates at utility scale, but of course we don't have that many. That was not the huge effort. It was really on the wind. So we have every taxing entity, every county, every year in a giant database to develop these tables.
This is very important for local authorities. Okay, if you're on a county board, you need to pay attention to this big time. And we have a very good juxtaposition to give you. The Champaign County, the county where I live, is just 50 miles to the east of where David lives in Bloomington Normal.
Mm-hmm.
And David is in McLean County. McLean County got, as he mentioned, some big wind farms very early in the development of the renewables industry here in Illinois, back in really starting in like 2009, right? Is when those wind farms really started to come into central Illinois in a big way. Well, what happened was Champaign County passed an ordinance, a wind ordinance that was extremely restrictive. And the wind developer said, okay, sayonara, I'm out, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is not going to work for me. And as a result, McLean County now has $50 million that it wouldn't have had. And Champaign County has $3 million. We do have a few wind turbines from the California Ridge wind development that is largely in a county to our east, Vermilion County. And so there's just a few turbines that are in Champaign County. We're surrounded on all sides, north, south, east, and west, by big wind farms now.
Mm-hmm.
But we're missing the boat. Now, luckily, we did not pass a restrictive solar ordinance here in Champaign County, and we are getting some utility scale solar. Crossing my fingers. It's taking forever for that project to come out of the ground. Meanwhile, there's big solar farms being developed all around us. Again, Coles County is getting a big one. And you know of several around the state that you've worked on personally. So, but it's a both and. We want the distributed generation and the utility scale. We cannot clean the grid without both of these things in a just manner. And so it's a both and our friends who are concerned about the utility scale can relax, I think, because the governor's made it clear that he wants to see consumer friendly clean power, and that's going to mean strong incentives for DG. Uh, so what else should we talk about this economic analysis, David?
Well, the one piece, so we've talked about the projections, we talked about the property taxes. The very first part of the report kind of goes on a historical basis to say what have been the economic impacts of those projects that have already been built. So we looked at the detailed property tax revenue, but we also looked at what are the jobs that have been created of all these projects that have been built to date. And the vast majority are on the wind side. But I wanted to do that, and I think it was important effort because it helps validate the Pathto100 projections. So you can say, no, we can look historically and say what have been the jobs, the earnings, the output that we've seen up until this point. And then that helps validate our numbers for projecting out. If we have this legislation, what will it be going forward? So we're not making any wild assumptions. We're marrying the two together to say, what have we already seen? If we see similar things going forward, what would this new legislation mean in terms of jobs? And so I think that's important. And what is disappointing in a certain sense is that we knew that this kind of bust, this cliff was coming at least a year and a half, 2 years ago, that the mechanism for funding the RPS was broken, that it was out of money. We're at less than 7% for of renewables when, according to our RPS schedule, we're supposed to be at 16%. So we're not even reaching that 25% goal. And so I think everybody saw we're going to need new enabling legislation. And it's a little disappointed that it's taken us 2 years to get to this point. I'm really, really hopeful that here in the month of May, we can get something done. Because we've been talking about it. So I'd like to see, some things come to fruition. And I'm very hopeful with the governor's proposal. I haven't read it. I think it's, 950 pages. So it'll take me a while to digest. But the executive summary, the bullet points do look favorable and seem to be in line with many of the things that were being proposed in the Pathto100 legislation.
Yeah, since you mentioned Consumers and Climate First Act, I'm going to put the summary on screen here and encourage people to check that out as well. If you just go to illinois.gov and then search on those keywords, you will find this summary: Consumers and Climate First Act. And there's several components here. This is on the tail of a scandal that involved Commonwealth Edison. And so there's front and center ethics and accountability, right? We're trying to make it clear to the utilities that behavior is not going to be tolerated. And so they're just putting a line in the sand there. Prohibit utility companies from using ratepayer funds for their charitable contributions. That was another problem. Require an annual Exelon audit. So Exelon is the owner of Commonwealth Edison, and we just want to make sure there's no monkey business going on. Consumer protections. Prohibit natural gas companies from automatically imposing monthly surcharges, eliminating consumer deposits and late fees, require utility companies to accurately report to the ICC, that's the Illinois Commerce Commission, and then renewable energy and labor standards put the state on a path towards 100% clean energy by 2050. Yes, we need to do this. Obviously, the Biden administration is now on this trajectory as well. So it's great if the states can get in sync with the federal government on this. And, over 100 cities and states around the country have already laid down 100% clean power RPSs, right, David? So we're really a latecomer to this party. And so it's not only a must if we're going to stop climate change, but it's totally economically feasible. It's going to be good for the economies of these states that really go after the clean energy economy. And here they're saying we're going to require project labor agreements on utility scale wind and solar projects. This is referring to paying prevailing wages and involving the unions, and that's a good thing. And then improving net metering to appropriately credit customers for electricity that they add to the grid. Net metering is very important. We have a show with CALSA, the California Solar and Storage Association, where net metering is under attack in California. If you don't have net metering, you do not have distributed generation in your state, because it's a 1-for-1 basically, right? The consumer gets full credit for those electrons they get from their rooftop solar farm. And it's just vital. So anyway, check out the Consumers and Climate First Act. In addition, I want to point people to your website, David. Strategic Economic Research is now on screen, and that's strategiceconomic.com is the URL. You've done a number of studies. If you would, please give us a little summary of your economic research.
Yeah, so I'm a professor at Illinois State University and have been involved in renewable energy and doing research for quite a number of years. But my consulting firm is one that just grew out of developers coming and saying, can you do a study for my particular project? Previously, I'd been looking at the state as a whole, and so started out in wind and now has moved to solar. Started out again in Illinois, but now has quickly moved. My website says 24 states, so I'll say 24 states that we've done studies in on both the wind and solar side. So typically, we would work with a developer, look at their costs, do the same type of methodology that we did for Pathto100, but at the project level scale, and looked at what are the property taxes that are going to flow out to all the taxing entities. And on the solar side, what we found was there's, as you mentioned earlier, there's oftentimes pushback on taking prime farmland, especially here in central Illinois, but across the Midwest. You're taking farmland and putting solar panels on it. And what we do through our analysis is basically confirm what you just said. You get typically lease payments with an escalation factor, but we put it in agricultural terms. So we put that in terms of what price would you have to get for your corn and soybeans in order for you to match what solar is yielding to your land. And what would your yields have to rise to? How productive would your land have to be in order to match that? And I think the other thing that's important to keep in mind is there's oftentimes a way to keep that land in the family, because I've seen many landowners that are in their 60s and 70s, don't have kids who want to take over the family farm. But they want to keep the farm whole. They want to keep the land in the family. And so this will take it out of agricultural production for 30 years, but it reverts back to agricultural use at the end of that time. All these projects have decommissioning plans that'll revert it back to original use. And so then they can make a decision, or their kids or grandkids can make decision of what they want to do with the family farm. And so I think it's a great thing. We actually have, a surplus of land right now. So in order to divert it for different uses on a temporary basis, seems like a win-win to me.
Yeah, Bill McKibben has a new piece in the New Yorker magazine uh, breaking down the carbon tracker report on the global transition to renewable energy. We receive 10,000 times more energy from the sun than we can use.
Mm.
And what carbon trackers analysis is that we just need less than 1% of the land area to convert that to wind and solar,
Mhm.
to generate 100% of our power across the board. Okay, we're talking all applications, transportation, industry, etc. We can completely decarbonize our economy with 1%. So we are swimming in land. Of course, we're also swimming in ocean. And, the offshore wind industry is booming and is going to continue to do so. There's now even floating solar on the ocean. They have technologies for putting solar panels on the ocean. This is going to be very popular with island nations like Japan.
Mhm.
Um, and up and down our coast. Of course, we are also a coastal country. So huge opportunity at a relatively small cost. The other thing is, the backdrop here, David, is that the economics of industrial farming are broken. 30% of our farmers' income is subsidies now in the Midwest. 30%. And what that tells us is that change is coming, right? They are going to be disrupted one way or another. And so if they want to stay on the land, they're going to have to be creative and open to change. And as you also said, this isn't hurting the land. This is actually going to help the land. If you convert your farm to solar farm, it's just steel piles in the ground and some buried cables. All of that can be taken away in 20 or 30 years. And if it's treated well while it's a solar farm, you have organic farm ground, which is going to be even more valuable than it was to begin with. I'm an ecologist by training, and so I understand these things. The
Mhm.
soil ecosystem is extremely important, and it will only get more vibrant as you tread less on the land with heavy chemicals. So it is truly a win-win for these rural communities to consider renewable energy. Now, of course, it's only a fraction of them that are going to benefit, right? Because we're talking a small fraction of the landscape. So many landowners approach me and say, "Hey, I've got this land. I want to do a solar project." And I'm like, "Sorry, man. Right now, the developers aren't looking for new projects. I mean, if you're close to a major substation, that may be the case. Okay.
Mhm.
Um, and feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to educate you. And the same with David. I'm sure people approach you as well, David.
Yeah.
And so, well, I want to make a couple of announcements, and then we're going to wrap up. You
Okay.
can find all of our content here at the Solar Podcast at cesnrg.com/podcast. We're bringing you interviews with thought leaders like Mr. Klangina and Rodriguez talking about grid interactive buildings and intelligent project siting with Rich Henry at Pivot. They have a wonderful GIS tool for utility scale developers that are trying to figure out where is the best place to put my wind or solar farm. And then we bring you tools and technology like rooftop storage with Omid Badkube and Yada Energy. They are making a 1 kWh battery that you put behind solar panels on commercial rooftops. And then I mentioned the fight for net metering with Bernadette Del Chiaro. She is the executive director of CALSA, the California Solar and Storage Association. So there's just tons and tons of good content here. And then we're also doing a weekly rundown of the news um, with myself and John Weaver. It's called the Clean Power Hour. Those publish every Wednesday. Typically, this week we have 2 editions of the Clean Power Hour. because we had a special show with Meyer Burger. The CEO of Meyer Burger came on the show, and we're checking out their new technology. They have released a high performance, super low carbon solar panel. So check it out at cesnrg.com. You can also reach me on Twitter, TG Montague on Twitter. David, how can people reach you besides your website?
Besides my website, email is dave@strategiceconomic.com. I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter. So either of those places should be able to find me.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank my guest, David Loomis. He is a professor of economics at Illinois State University and the president of Strategic Economic Research. Thank you so much, and let's grow solar and storage.